Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. The auditorium at the University of Providence buzzed with the energy of students settling in for another lecture in French literature. Daniel Walker adjusted his brown blazer as he organized his notes on the table, his fingers drumming gently on the worn cover of his favorite edition of Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. The front row, as always, was occupied by Audrey Laurent, the French exchange student who had arrived in Rhode Island just 3 months ago. Her attentive eyes never missed a move by the teacher, something Daniel had noticed since the first day of class. He smiled warmly in her direction, a gesture that was part of his daily routine. Aujourd'hui nous allons parler de l'amour dans la poésie française. Daniel began, his voice filling the room with the musicality of French. As he talked about love and French poetry, his thoughts inevitably wandered to Natalie Morrison, professor of art history in the same department. Natalie had come into his life 2 years ago during a conference on French Impressionism. The coffee spilled on her white shirt had been the perfect pretext for a conversation that went on for hours. Since then, their days have been filled with discussions about art, literature, and shared dreams about a future life in Paris. The lecture went smoothly, but Daniel couldn't ignore the message that had been flashing on his cell phone since the morning. We need to talk lunch in the library garden. Natalie's text seemed to carry a weight that he couldn't define. When the last student left the auditorium, Daniel noticed that Audrey remained in her seat, apparently absorbed in her notes. She always did that. She stayed for a few extra minutes, as if to absorb every trace of the lesson that had just ended. Mademoiselle Laurent, vous allez être en retard pour votre prochain cours, he remarked gently, reminding her of her next class. Audrey looked up from her notebook, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. Oui, professeur, je réfléchissais just a votre lecture, sir. Apollinaire. She began to put her belongings away, but her movements were deliberately slow. Daniel checked his watch. 11:45. Lunch with Natalie was scheduled for noon. Crossing the campus, he watched the students spread out on the lawn, enjoying the soft October sunshine. The air carried that characteristic New England fall, sent a mixture of dried leaves and promises of change. In the library garden, his heart almost stopped. Natalie was not alone. Adrian Bennett, the new modern history teacher, was by her side. Daniel knew Adrian from department meetings, an eloquent man with a British accent that made the students sigh. In an impressive knowledge of medieval France, he approached slowly, picking up fragments of the conversation in French. Adrian and Natalie always talked in French. Je t'aime. Adrian's words floated up to Daniel like leaves blown by the wind. Je t'aime depuis le premier jour. Natalie, with tears in her eyes, held Adrian's hands. Her face revealed a mixture of guilt and relief when she finally noticed Daniel's presence. Danny. The world seemed to slow down. The voices of the surrounding students became a distant murmur. Daniel felt the weight of Les Fleurs du Mal in his briefcase, an anchor that kept him connected to reality while his heart was breaking. He comprends, he said softly, surprising himself with the calm in his voice. L'amour, the command pas. Love cannot be commanded, a phrase he had discussed so many times in his classes, but which had never hurt as much as it did at that moment. What Daniel didn't realize was that Audrey was sitting on a nearby bench, partially hidden by an old magnolia tree. Her wide eyes absorbed every detail of the scene, her hands nervously clutching her notebook. Natalie tried to speak, but Daniel held up his hand gently. Vous êtes beaux ensemble, he continued in French, maintaining the dignity that years of studying French literature had taught him. Que votre amour soit aussi beau que les vers de Rimbaud. Turning around, Daniel began to walk back to the literature building. His steps were firm, although his heart was in pieces. Behind him, Audrey closed her notebook silently, her eyes following the figure of the professor, who had just shown more poetry in his farewell than in all his classes on the great French romantics. That afternoon, as the sun painted the campus in golden hues, 3 lives took unexpected turns. Daniel in his office stared at a photograph of himself and Natalie in front of Notre Dame, wondering how something so solid could fall apart so quickly. Natalie and Adrian stood in the garden, their intertwined hands carrying both promise and guilt, and Audrey, alone in her dormitory, wrote furiously in her diary, her words mixing French and English as an idea began to take shape in her mind, an idea that would change not only her life, but also that of her French literature teacher. Daniel spent the next 3 days avoiding the university's usual corridors, redesigning his routes to Minimize the chances of running into Natalie or Adrie in his office. Once a sanctuary of French literature and lively conversations with students became a silent refuge where he buried himself in administrative work and thesis revisions. On the morning of the fourth day, a soft knock on his door interrupted his attempt to concentrate on an article about Simone de Beauvoir interests. He answered automatically, expecting to find yet another student with questions about the next assignment. Audrey Laurent was standing on the threshold, holding a stack of books against her chest like a shield. "Professor Walker, puis-je vous parler un moment?" Daniel gestured for her to enter, noticing how her fingers nervously gripped the spine of a worn copy of Le Petit Prince. There was something different about his usual demeanor, a determination that replaced his usual shyness. "Je vous have vu dans le jardin." She began switching to English as she noticed the expression that crossed Daniel's face. "I saw what happened, and I think you should know something." The professor adjusted his reading glasses, a nervous habit he had developed over the years. "Mademoiselle Laurent, there's nothing to please call me Audrey." She interrupted him, her voice gaining confidence. "And yes, there is something. For weeks now I've been observing how Adrian Bennett circulates around the history of our department. It wasn't an accident, Professor Walker. He's been planning this ever since he got here." Audrey's words fell like stones into a still pond, creating ripples that disturbed the apparently calm surface Daniel was trying to maintain. She continued, revealing how she had witnessed conversations, accidental encounters in the corridors, and the calculated way in which Adrian had approached Natalie. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked, his voice huskier than he intended. Audrey put the books on the table and pulled up a chair. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because," she hesitated, a blush creeping up her neck, "because your lesson on Apollinaire last week changed my life. You talked about how true poetry comes from the brutal honesty of the heart, even when it hurts. And then I saw you in that garden, living every word you taught." Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting Audrey's words fill the emptiness that had settled in his chest since that afternoon in the garden. She continued speaking, her voice alternating between French and English, sharing her own story of loss and redemption. "In Paris before coming to Providence, I have a proposal," she finally said. "I'm organizing a study group in contemporary French literature. I need an advisor, and you need a constructive distraction." The proposal took Daniel by surprise. At other times, he would have politely declined, maintaining the professional distance he had always cherished, but something in Audrey's sincerity, mixed with his own need to rebuild, made him consider. When would the first date be, he found himself asking. Surprising them both, Audrey's smile lit up the room. "Cette soir, I know a café near Campus Le Petit Coin. They serve the best pain au chocolate in Rhode Island." That evening, sitting at a corner table at Le Petit Coin, Daniel discovered that there was more comfort in discussing Marguerite Duras with a student with a passion for literature than in brooding over his own sorrows. Audrey brought along 3 more students: Michelle, an aspiring translator; Kevin, a musician obsessed with symbolist poetry; and Rachel, a film student fascinated by the Nouvelle Vague. As the evening progressed, and the discussion flowed naturally between literary analysis and personal experiences, Daniel felt something awaken in his chest. It wasn't healing, not yet, but perhaps it was hope. He watched as Audrey led the conversation with a mixture of enthusiasm and sensitivity, her eyes shining when she quoted favorite passages, her hands drawing in the air the emotions the words evoked. At the end of the meeting, while the other students were saying goodbye, Audrey stayed on to help Daniel organize the notes they had taken. "Mime dans l'obscurité il y a de la lumière," she murmured, quoting one of the poems they had discussed. Daniel looked at her with renewed curiosity, realizing that perhaps the light she mentioned wasn't just in the books they shared, but in literature's own ability to build bridges between wounded souls. In search of healing, the news of Daniel and Natalie's breakup spread across campus like ink on wet paper, staining every corridor with whispers and compassionate glances. The French literature study group, initially an attempt to escape, became a safe haven for Daniel. Over the next 2 weeks, growing from 4 to 12 participants, "Aujourd'hui nous discuterons de Marguerite Yourcenar," announced Audrey, naturally taking on the role of co-facilitator during the third meeting. At Le Petit Coin, the café had reserved its reading room for the group, a cozy space with floor-to-ceiling bookcases and vintage lamps that created an intimate atmosphere. Daniel watched with admiration as Audrey led the discussion. Her presence had become an unexpected balm, filling the empty spaces. Natalie had left with something completely different, not a substitute, but a new form of connection that he still didn't fully understand. "Professor Walker, Michelle raised her hand. Is there a correlation between Hadrian's search for meaning in Memoirs de Hadrian and our own search for identity before Daniel could answer? Audrey intervened. Pensez-y bien, every page we turn in our lives is like a chapter of Yourcenar complex, sometimes painful, but always transformative. Their gazes met briefly, and Daniel realized that she wasn't just talking about literature. The moment was interrupted by Kevin, who began to recite a passage from the book in perfect French, his voice filling the room with the musicality of the words. After the session, while the other participants were saying goodbye, Rachel approached Daniel with an intriguing proposal. We're organizing a screening of French films next week, and it would be an honor to have you and Audrey for a debate after the screening. Oui bien sûr. Daniel replied, automatically realizing too late that he had answered for Audrey. As well, she smiled, her eyes sparkling with something that looked like amusement, and perhaps something more. The next day, during his regular class, Daniel noticed a subtle change in his own way of teaching. His analyses of texts became more personal, more visceral. When discussing Alain Fournier's Le Grand Monde, he found himself talking about how the search for the ideal can blind us to the beauty of what is in front of us. Monsieur Walker, Audrey approached him after class. May I suggest something for the study group? I thought we might have a special session on contemporary French women writers. I have some contacts in Paris who could participate via video conference. Her excitement was contagious. Say on. Excellent day. Daniel replied, realizing that he was smiling more easily now. We could expand it to a department-wide event. As they walked together across campus, discussing the details, Daniel saw Natalie and Adrian leaving the library. His heart still ached, but in a different way, more distantly, like an old scar that occasionally tingles. Audrey, sensing his momentary tension, started talking about Annie Ernaux and her unique perspective on love and loss. Have you ever thought, she asked, pausing under a red maple, that sometimes we need to lose something precious in order to find something precious in a completely different way? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Daniel adjusted his glasses, a gesture that Audrey had already learned to recognize as a sign that he was processing something important. You know, Audrey, he began, choosing his words carefully. When Proust wrote about involuntary memory in A la recherche du temps perdu, he showed us that sometimes it's the unexpected moments that bring us back to life. The October wind played with Audrey's hair, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself to notice how the late afternoon light illuminated her in an almost ethereal way. She wasn't Natalie, she was something completely new and unexplored, like an unopened book. Le Cinéma Weekend alors, she asked, breaking the moment with a shy smile. Oui, he replied, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced for weeks. But first we need to plan this event on contemporary women writers. How about a coffee? As they made their way to Le Petit Coin, Daniel realized that he was turning a new page in his own story. The chapter with Natalie was over, but maybe, just maybe, the next chapter promised to be even more interesting than the last. What he didn't know was that Audrey kept pages and pages of reflections in her diary about him, about literature, and about how some loves begin not with thunder and lightning, but with the soft whisper of pages being turned, one after the other, until two different stories intertwine to form a completely new narrative. The French movie screening turned into a bigger event than either Daniel or Audrey had imagined. The university's small auditorium was packed for the screening of Truffaut's Les Quatre Cents Coups, with students even sitting on the side steps. C'est incroyable, whispered Audrey, leaning towards Daniel as the lights dimmed. The soft lavender perfume she wore mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that Rachel had provided for the event. During the movie, Daniel found himself dividing his attention between the screen and Audrey's profile, watching how she reacted to each important scene, her lips moving silently along with the dialogue. She clearly knew by heart there was something mesmerizing about the way she experienced every moment of the film, as if it were her first time. The discussion after the screening was even more revealing. Audrey demonstrated a deep knowledge not only of French cinema, but also of its intersection with the literature they loved so much. When a student asked about André Gide's influence on Truffaut's work, she came up with an answer that left Daniel amazed. It's fascinating how literature and cinema intertwine, Daniel added, his eyes meeting Audrey's. How two art forms can intersect, how two art forms can feed off each other, creating something completely new. The discussion continued at Le Petit Coin, where a smaller group gathered for a late coffee. Kevin brought out his guitar and started softly playing Serge Gainsbourg songs, creating an even more Parisian atmosphere in the already naturally welcoming cafe. Professor Walker, Rachel caught his eye. Don't you think Audrey should lead the department's next event? Her analysis today was exceptional. Daniel noticed the blush on Audrey's cheeks. Absolutely. In fact, I was thinking of proposing a more formal collaboration between the two of us. To his sentence was interrupted by Natalie's unexpected arrival. She was alone, looking hesitant at the entrance to the cafe. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft notes of Kevin's guitar. "Je vous parler un moment," Natalie asked Daniel, her voice trembling slightly. Audrey started to get up, but Daniel lightly touched her arm. "S'il vous plaît, restez," he asked softly before turning to Natalie. "We can talk right here." What followed was a conversation that Daniel had imagined dozens of times over the last few weeks, but the reality was surprisingly different. Natalie explained about her history with Adrian, about the doubts that had consumed her, about how she had tried to fight her feelings. "You deserved better than that, Danny," she concluded, her eyes watering. "You deserve to know before you deserved a better explanation." Daniel looked at his own reflection in the half-empty coffee cup, surprised at how calm he felt. "You know, Natalie, I've been thinking a lot about Proust lately." He began, adjusting his glasses, "about how time not only heals but also helps us to better understand our own stories." Audrey, who had remained silent, quoted softly, "Le temps retrouve n'est pas perdu." Natalie looked between the two of them, a silent understanding appearing in her eyes. "Vous avez changed, Danny," she said with a small smile. "In a good way." After Natalie left, the group gradually dispersed until only Daniel and Audrey remained, sharing one last coffee and a slice of tart tatin. "How are you feeling?" Audrey asked her, voice laden with genuine concern. Daniel considered the question for a moment, watching the last few people leave the cafe. "You know, when you're reading a book," he began, "and you reach that moment when you realize that the story has taken a completely different turn from what you expected, but somehow it makes perfect sense." Audrey nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I feel like that," he continued. "Like I'm discovering that the story I thought I was living was just the prologue to something more authentic." She suggested, her hand unconsciously moving closer to his on the table. He replied, noticing for the first time how the coffee lights created a golden halo around her hair. "Mais authentique." The moment was interrupted by the cafe owner announcing that it was closing. As they walked across campus towards the parking lot, a light drizzle began to fall, creating halos around the lampposts. "Professor Walker," Audrey began, but Daniel gently interrupted her. "Daniel," he corrected. "I guess after today you can call me Daniel." She smiled, that smile he was beginning to associate with moments of clarity and possibility. "Daniel," she repeated, savoring the name. "I have an idea for our next project, something that combines literature, cinema, and maybe a bit of music, something of our own." The hour hovered between them, laden with unspoken promises. Daniel realized he was smiling, not the polite smile he usually gave in his classes, but something truer, more spontaneous. "Tell me more," he said, stopping under the shelter of a tree, the rain creating a silver curtain around them. And as Audrey began to explain her idea, Daniel felt that he was finally learning to read his own story with new eyes. Daniel and Audrey's joint project quickly took shape over the next few weeks, turning into an ambitious festival that blended French literature, film, and music. The campus was buzzing with preparations, and Le Petit Coin became the event's unofficial headquarters. Registrations have already exceeded 200 people, Audrey announced, spreading papers on the table she and Daniel shared. It was late afternoon, and the cafe was relatively empty, except for a few scattered students and the soft sound of Edith Piaf in the background. Daniel watched as she methodically organized the lists of participants, her delicate fingers moving with precision between the sheets. Over the last few days, he had begun to notice little details about her, how she bit her lower lip slightly when she was concentrating, how her eyes took on a special sparkle when she talked about Camus, how her French accent became more pronounced when she was excited. "We need to decide on the closing," she continued, unaware of his gaze. "Kevin suggested a musical performance based on Verlaine's poems, and Rachel wants to project scenes from Nouvelle Vague films onto the walls of the auditorium during the performance." "It's ambitious," Daniel commented, leaning over to look at her notes. Their shoulders touched, lightly sending an electric current down his spine. "But I think we can make it work." Just then Michelle rushed into the cafe, her hair mussed by the November wind. "You won't believe it, I got in touch with Annie Ernaux through my aunt in Paris. She's agreed to make a virtual appearance at the festival." The news was extraordinary. Annie Ernaux, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, was one of France's most important contemporary authors. Daniel watched Audrey's face light up at the news, and his heart leapt involuntarily. "C'est incroyable." Audrey exclaimed, impulsively getting up to hug Michelle. Her sudden movement knocked over her coffee cup, which spilled onto the table, threatening the documents. Daniel reacted quickly, pulling the papers away from the liquid, while Audrey grabbed napkins. Their synchronized movements brought them closer, and for a moment, they were paralyzed, too close to maintain a pretense of a strictly professional relationship. Je suis désolé, Audrey murmured, her breath warm against Daniel's cheek. Non say, he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Rachel and Kevin carrying sound equipment to test the cafe's acoustics. The moment passed, but something had changed during the rest of the afternoon. As they finalized the details of the festival, Daniel realized that every interaction with Audrey carried a new weight and electricity that he could no longer ignore. Professor Wall, Daniel, Kevin called out, adjusting his guitar. Could you help us with the pronunciation of some of the lyrics? We want everything to be perfect for the performance. As they worked on the music, Daniel noticed Audrey chatting animatedly with Rachel. By the window, the sunset light was coming through the glass, creating a prismatic effect that seemed to envelop her in a golden halo. She laughed at something Rachel said, and the sound of her laughter penetrated deep in her chest. L'amour est dans l'air, Michelle commented softly beside him, following his gaze. Daniel adjusted his glasses, trying to maintain a professional air. Michelle, you know that. I know you're our teacher, she interrupted gently. But I also know that Audrey finishes her exchange in 2 weeks, and that she has received an offer to continue her studies here in Providence. The information took him by surprise. Audrey hadn't mentioned anything about staying. His heart raced at the possibilities this revelation presented. Besides, Michelle continued with a knowing smile, we've seen how you look at her when you think no one is paying attention. Before Daniel could reply, Audrey approached them carrying a folder with the supplier's contracts. Everything all right here? Oui, Michelle replied, standing up with a discreet smile. Actually, I need to go. I have an appointment with Rachel to finalize the script for the presentation. When they were alone, a comfortable silence settled between them. Audrey began organizing the papers, her hands moving with studied grace across the table. I understand you've been offered a position here, Daniel finally said, his voice softer than he had intended. Audrey stopped her movements, looking at him in surprise. I'm considering it. There are reasons to stay. Their gazes met, and at that moment all the unspoken words of the last few months seemed to hang between them, thick as the mist that was beginning to form outside the cafe. Audrey, Daniel D. They spoke at the same time and laughed nervously. The owner of the cafe began to turn off some lights, signaling that it was almost closing time. Tomorrow, Daniel said softly. Can we talk tomorrow after the final committee meeting? Audrey nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Demain alors. As they walked out of the cafe, the mist had turned into a light drizzle. Daniel offered his coat to protect her, and the simple gesture carried the weight of all the possibilities that tomorrow could bring. The day of the festival dawned with a typical Providence fog enveloping the campus. In a silvery veil that looked like something out of a French movie, Daniel was adjusting his bow tie in front of the mirror in his apartment, his fingers trembling slightly as he thought about the conversation he planned to have with Audrey after the event. The university's main auditorium had been transformed into a little Paris. Posters of classic French films decorated the walls, and the aroma of fresh croissants from Le Petit Coin filled the room. Rachel had exceeded all expectations with the projections on the walls. Iconic scenes from French cinema danced silently across the vintage wallpaper. C'est magnifique, Audrey exclaimed as she entered the salon. She was wearing a navy blue dress that made her eyes shine even brighter. Daniel felt his heart skip a beat at the sight of her. She looked like she'd stepped straight out of a Jean-Luc Godard movie. We need to check the connection to Paris, she said, stepping closer to him. Ernal will be on in 2 hours. The sound check with Paris turned out to be more complicated than expected. While technicians ran around adjusting equipment, Daniel and Audrey found themselves alone in a corner of the stage. About our conversation yesterday, Daniel began, but was interrupted by Michelle, who rushed in with urgent news about a problem with the catering. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. The festival attracted not only students and teachers, but also members of Rhode Island's French community. Between performances, Daniel watched Audrey coordinate everything with a natural grace, alternating perfectly between English and French. During Kevin's musical performance, which transformed Verlaine's poems into contemporary melodies, Daniel noticed Natalie and Adrian in the audience. Surprisingly, the sight didn't cause any pain, just a gentle feeling of completion, like closing a book after reading the last chapter. Annie Ernaux's virtual participation was the highlight of the event. The French author, with a characteristic Elegance spoke about love memory and the art of transforming personal experiences into universal literature. During her talk, Daniel couldn't take his eyes off Audrey, who was simultaneously translating for the participants who didn't speak French. L'amour n'est pas seulement une histoire que nous racontons certainement, c'est une histoire que nous racontons. Love is not just the story we tell, it's a story that tells us. The words resonated deeply with Daniel, who realized how his own story had changed in recent months. What had begun as a personal tragedy had turned into something entirely new and unexpected. After the virtual book signing, as the guests dispersed for a cocktail in the garden, Daniel finally got a moment alone with Audrey in the technical control room. "Are you really considering staying in Providence?" he asked, his heart hammering against his chest. Audrey leaned on the soundboard, her fingers playing nervously with a cable. "The university has offered a research assistant position in the comparative literature department." "And what do you want?" Daniel asked softly, taking a step towards her. "Je favor," she began in French, but stopped, searching for the right words. "I want to stay not just for the position, but..." The moment was interrupted by Rachel, who burst into the room announcing that it was time for the final performance, a musical adaptation of Baudelaire's poems that Kevin had prepared especially for the closing. As the lights in the auditorium dimmed and the first notes of L'Invitation au Voyage filled the air, Daniel and Audrey found themselves side by side in the last row on stage. Images of Paris mingled with verses projected on the walls, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. "Lux com et volupté," Kevin sang, his voice blending with the soft sound of the guitar. Daniel felt Audrey's hand lightly brushes in the dark. With a gentle movement, he entwined his fingers with hers. She didn't withdraw her hand, and in that simple moment, a silent promise was made. When the last notes faded and the light slowly came on, they remained motionless, their hands still joined, as if they feared that the slightest movement could break the enchantment of the moment. "Daniel," Audrey whispered, turning to him. "Il quelque chose que je dois te dire." But before she could continue, a wave of applause erupted in the auditorium, and the intimate moment was swallowed up by the collective celebration of the festival's success. As people rose to their feet for a standing ovation, Daniel and Audrey exchanged a look that carried the weight of all the words still unspoken. The evening was far from over, and Providence held more surprises for the French literature professor and his former student, who had become much more than just a collaborator on a cultural project. The post-festival celebration extended to Le Petit Coin, with the owner thrilled with the success of the event. Kept the doors open beyond the usual hours. The cafe was filled with excited voices mixing French and English, while Kevin continued to play softly on the small makeshift stage. Daniel and Audrey found a moment of privacy at a secluded table near the window overlooking the campus garden. The fog had cleared, revealing a starry sky that seemed to conspire in their favor. Before we were interrupted, Audrey began, her French accent more pronounced due to emotion. "I wanted to tell you something important." Daniel adjusted his glasses, a gesture Audrey had already learned to associate with moments of anxiety or anticipation. "Bécote," he replied softly. "When I arrived in Providence," she continued, her fingers playing nervously with her coffee cup, "I thought it would be just another year of studies, another chapter in my academic life." But then she paused, searching for the right words. Then that afternoon in the garden happened. Daniel felt his heart race, remembering the moment that had changed everything. "The day, Natalie." "Non," Audrey interrupted him gently. "The day I saw a man turn pain into poetry. The day I realized that all the love stories we studied in your classes were just preludes to understanding what was happening to me." Across the cafe, Michelle smiled discreetly as she watched the scene unfold and pulled Rachel and Kevin away, giving the couple more privacy. "The university offered," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. "Have you decided?" "Oui, non," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "I accepted the position, but my decision wasn't based solely on academic opportunity." The silence that followed was full of possibilities. Daniel reached across the table, lightly touching Audrey's fingers. "You know, there's a line by Apollinaire that hasn't stopped echoing in my mind over the last few months. Le temps de l'amour s'en revient, the time of love returns." Audrey translated automatically, her eyes shining with restrained tears. When Natalie left, Daniel continued, his voice low and intense. "I thought I had lost not just a love, but my connection to everything that French literature represented to me. Then you came along with your brilliant analyses and your infectious enthusiasm, and I realized that I was just beginning to understand the true meaning of the words I'd spent my life teaching." Daniel, Audrey whispered, entwining her fingers with his J-pair of what? That this is just another chapter that ends when the semester is over, that the age difference are teacher-student history's social conventions? Daniel smiled, interrupting her fears with a gentle squeeze of her hand. Do you know what Proust would say about that? That the true paradises are the lost paradises, she ventured, a shy smile appearing on her lips. Non, he replied, standing up and holding out his hand to her. That the only true paradise is the one we have the courage to create together. They walked out of the cafe into the Providence night. The campus was silent, only the street lights illuminating their path. They stopped under the same magnolia tree where Audrey had witnessed the end of Daniel's relationship months ago. It's funny, she said, looking at the leaves of the tree, how life has a poetic way of circling. Like a well-written novel, Daniel agreed, turning to face her. Audrey Lauron, you change my story. It vous avez changed la mienne, Professor Walker, she replied, moving closer. Their first kiss was as soft as the pages of an old book full of promise and possibility. When they broke apart, they both laughed as they realized that some of the magnolia leaves had fallen on them, as if nature itself were applauding. So, Daniel said, adjusting a lock of Audrey's hair, about that research project on contemporary literature. She replied, her eyes twinkling with amusement. I think we'll need a lot more than a semester to develop it properly. How long do you suggest, Professor? As long as it takes to write our own story. The next morning, the literature department at the University of Providence woke up to discover that their most reserved professor and his brilliant exchange student had become the new couple on campus. Michelle, Rachel, and Kevin exchanged complicit smiles during class while Daniel discussed French romanticism with a renewed sparkle in his eyes. And in her diary, Audrey wrote, Aujourd'hui j'ai compris que l'amour n'est pas seulement dans les livres ils dans les regards changes dans les mots non dits dans les moments où deux aimes décident d'écrire ensemble leur propre histoire. Today I understood that love isn't just in books, it's in the glances exchanged, in the unspoken words, in the moments when two souls decide to write their own story together. In Providence, where fall was painting the streets in golden hues and new chapter was beginning, a chapter that proved that sometimes you have to lose a love to find an even truer one, and that the most beautiful literature is not just on the pages of books, but in the courage to live our own love stories.